The old-timers used to say the plains never forgot a name once it tasted blood. Long after a man was buried, long after his bones turned quiet beneath sun-bleached earth, the wind would still carry his reputation across dry miles and empty trails. Campfire talk had a way of resurrecting the dead, especially the dangerous ones. And among those whispered names, spoken low, like a curse or a prayer, was the gunman everyone believed had been swallowed by dust and time. A man whose shadow once cleared saloons before his boots crossed the threshold. A man the frontier claimed, then buried, then pretended never to need again. They said his end came years back in a narrow canyon where the walls rose like teeth and the sun only touched the ground at noon. An ambush, clean and final. Lead from 3 sides. Horses screaming. Smoke trapped between rock and sky. When the echoes died, so did the legend. No body was ever brought back, but no one doubted the outcome. Men like him didn't get old. The West accepted his death as a form of forgiveness it rarely offered. Now the desert town of Red Willow stood where the wind cut hardest, its buildings crouched low as if trying to avoid being noticed by the land itself. Red canyons ringed it like a broken crown, their walls glowing rust and gold at sunset. The courthouse squatted at the center of town, with warped windows clouded with years of dust. Beside it rose a single gallows, newly repaired, its rope pale and clean against the sky. Vultures lingered on nearby rooftops, patient and certain, as if they knew something the townsfolk refused to say out loud. People moved carefully in Red Willow. They spoke softly, eyes always shifting. Fear had weight here, and it pressed down on every conversation. That fear had a name now, carried by 6 men who rode in together months earlier and never bothered to ride out. They wore their cruelty like fine coats and treated the town as if it were already theirs. No one challenged them. No one remembered how. At the edge of town, where the dirt road thinned into scrub and cactus, a woman worked a small ranch with hands hardened by sun and solitude. Her name was Eleanor Hale, though most folks still thought of her as the sister of the dead gunman. She had stayed when others fled. Stayed when whispers followed her into church and shop doors closed too quickly. She carried her brother's reputation like a second shadow, though her life had been nothing like his. Eleanor rose before dawn each day, drew water from a well, and tended to her cattle with quiet determination. She fixed her own fences, broke her own horses, and never asked for help she knew wouldn't come. There was strength in her, the kind that didn't announce itself. Moral strength, earned through endurance rather than force. She believed the land was honest, even when people were not. The gang came to her ranch one afternoon, riding slow, smiling the way men did when they thought they already owned what they were looking at. Their leader, a sharp-eyed man with a silver buckle and a voice smooth as oiled leather, told her the land would be better off under different management. He offered money that smelled like blood. Eleanor listened, steady and unafraid, then told him no. Told him the land wasn't for sale. Told him to leave. They laughed. Men like that always did. But laughter curdled fast when denied. 2 days later, a body was found near the creek that fed Eleanor's fields. One of the gang's hired guns, shot clean through the chest. By sundown, fingers pointed toward her ranch. Lies spread faster than truth ever could. A witness claimed to have seen her arguing with the dead men. Another swore they heard a gunshot from her direction. The gang stood back, innocent as saints, letting the town do what fear had trained it to do. Eleanor was arrested before nightfall. Shackled. Dragged past faces she recognized, faces that looked away. The sheriff, a man who once spoke of law and duty, wouldn't meet her eyes. He read the charge with shaking hands and called it justice. Everyone knew it was survival. The trial came quick, almost hurried, like the town was afraid of what might happen if they waited too long. No real evidence. No real defense. Just a room full of people desperate to keep the gang calm and the violence pointed elsewhere. Eleanor stood alone, back straight, eyes clear. She spoke when asked, told the truth simply, without ornament. It didn't matter. The verdict had been decided long before she stepped inside. When the sentence was read, a sound moved through the room. Not relief, not anger, but something heavier. Resignation. The gallows would have its due at dawn. That night, Red Willow slept poorly. Lanterns burned longer than usual. Doors stayed barred. The rope creaked softly in the breeze, testing its own purpose. Eleanor sat in a narrow cell, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall where her brother's name once had been scratched by some cruel soul years ago. She thought of him as he had been before the blood, before the stories. A boy who laughed too loud. A man who chose the wrong way to protect what he loved. She did not cry. There was nothing left to beg for. Far beyond the canyons, where the land fell away into open desert and the stars hung low and sharp, a lone figure sat by a small fire. His coat was worn thin, his hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there in his youth. A long rifle rested beside him, wrapped in cloth, its weight familiar as memory. He listened as a drifter paused near the flames, warming his hands, trading news for silence. The drifter mentioned a town, a gallows, a woman facing the rope come morning. He spoke her name. The men by the fire went very still, as if the desert itself had tightened its grip around his spine. The wind shifted. Somewhere, a coyote went quiet. And in that vast, patient land, a story everyone believed was finished took its first breath again. The jail heist smelled of old wood, rusted iron, and fear that had soaked too deeply into the grain to ever be scrubbed out. Eleanor Hale sat on the narrow bench beneath the single-barred window, her back straight despite the chill seeping up from the floor. Moonlight crept through the slats and laid pale stripes across her hands. She studied them quietly, these hands that had built fences, calmed horses, buried calves in hard winters. Hands that had never held a man's life, no matter what the town now believed. Night settled heavy around the cell, pressing memories loose. She saw herself as a girl again, barefoot and laughing, running through tall grass with her brother just ahead of her. He had always been faster, always daring her to keep up, always glancing back to make sure she hadn't fallen. Before the guns, before the blood, before the world taught him that kindness was weakness and patience could get you killed. Back then, he carried her across creeks so her shoes wouldn't get wet and swore he'd never let anything touch her. He meant it, too. That was the tragedy of it. The door creaked, and a deputy stepped inside with a lantern, his face drawn tight with guilt he didn't have the courage to act on. He asked if she wanted water, asked if there was anyone she wished to see. Eleanor shook her head gently. There was no one left to come. When the door closed again, the silence returned, thicker than before. Eleanor leaned her head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling beams. She did not pray for escape. She did not ask for mercy. If this was the end, she would meet it standing. All she wanted was for the truth not to die with her, for the world to remember that she had not bent, even when it would have been easier. Outside, Red Willow flickered with uneasy light. Lanterns burned in windows long after bedtime, their glow trembling like uncertain hearts. Doors were barred, curtains drawn. People whispered prayers behind locked frames, words they barely believed might travel beyond the walls. The gallows loomed in the square, its rope swaying gently in the night breeze, testing its strength against nothing at all. The gang occupied the saloon as if it were a private hall. Laughter spilled into the street, sharp and careless. Cards slapped against tables. Whiskey flowed. They drank to tomorrow, to silence, to land soon to be theirs. Their leader leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the rail, and scoffed when someone mentioned old legends. Dead men stayed dead, he said. Ghosts didn't ride anymore. The West had moved on. He did not know how often the West circled back on itself. Far beyond the town, the desert opened wide beneath a sky thick with stars. A lone rider cut across the hardpan, moving with steady purpose. His horse was strong but no longer young, its breath measured, its stride unhurried. The man in the saddle wore his years plainly. His shoulders were heavier than they used to be, his movements economical, shaped by long survival rather than speed. Across his back, wrapped carefully against dust and grit, lay a long rifle that never left his reach. The night wind tugged at the cloth covering it, and for a moment his hand settled over the stock, feeling the familiar grain beneath his palm. Memory stirred there, not of chaos or close-range fury, but of stillness, of distance, of choosing a moment and accepting its weight. That rifle had never been about speed. It was about certainty. One shot, one decision that could not be taken back. He rode through narrow canyons where sound carried strangely, every hoofbeat echoing like a question. He rode through open flats where the moon lit the land pale and unforgiving. The farther he went, the quieter he became. Words were no longer necessary. The road already knew where he was headed. Back in the cell, Eleanor lay down at last, resting her head on her folded coat. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams bled into memory. Her brother teaching her to shoot cans off a fence, not with a pistol but with a rifle far too long for her arms. He told her patience mattered more than strength, that the shot you waited for was always truer than the one you rushed. She remembered how serious he'd been then, how unlike the reckless men the stories would later describe. Footsteps passed. Keys rattled. Somewhere, a hammer struck wood as the gallows received one final inspection. Dawn crept closer. The gang finally spilled out of the saloon near midnight, voices loud, balance unsteady. They owned the night, owned the town, owned tomorrow. Their leader paused in the street, gazing toward the jailhouse with a smile that never touched his eyes. He tipped his hat mockingly toward the dark windows. Justice, he said, always found its way. He slept well. Eleanor woke before the light changed. The air had shifted, carrying that thin, expectant hush that came just before morning. The deputy returned, avoiding her gaze, and unlocked the cell. Shackles were placed on her wrists, cool and final. As they led her out, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The square filled slowly. Faces gathered. Some watched with pity, some with relief, some with a blankness born of too many compromises. The rope creaked softly as the hangman tested its length, pulling it taut, then letting it settle back into place. Eleanor stood beneath the beam, the world narrowing to breath and heartbeat. She looked out over the crowd, searching not for help but for witnesses. When the sheriff asked if she had any final words, she spoke clearly, without tremor. She said she was innocent. She said the truth would outlast lies, even if people did not. Then she fell silent. Far beyond Red Willow, as the first light brushed the canyon rims, a man reined in his horse. He slid from the saddle and unwrapped a rifle with care. Metal whispered softly as the action opened. A single round was seated, firm and deliberate. The sound was small, almost gentle, but it carried across the desert like a held breath finally released. In the town square, just as the noose was lifted into place, a sound rolled in from a distance. Not a shot, not yet, but the unmistakable click of a rifle chambered with intent. The sound did not belong to Red Willow. It came from beyond the town, beyond the fear and the rope and the shallow breath of a woman standing beneath a beam. It rolled in low and deliberate, the unmistakable language of steel set with purpose. The square went still. Even the rope seemed to pause, its sway arrested by something older and more dangerous than gravity. People turned as one toward the rise east of town, where the land lifted gently before breaking into canyon and screv. A figure stood there now, outlined against the early light. He had not been there a moment before, or perhaps no one had dared notice. He stood with his boots planted wide, a long rifle resting against his shoulder, the barrel angled not toward the gallows but above it, commanding the space without yet claiming a life. Time rearranged itself around him. He was broader than the stories remembered, his frame thickened by years that had not been kind. His hair was streaked with iron gray, his beard rough and trimmed without care. Scars mapped his face, old, pale lines carved by knives and lead in the slow erosion of survival. Yet there was no mistaking him. Some truths lived deeper than rumor. The man on the rise was the gunman Red Willow had buried without a body, the name people spoke only after checking who was listening. A murmur rippled through the crowd, swelling into disbelief. Someone whispered his name. Someone else crossed themselves. The sheriff felt his knees weaken. Eleanor saw him then, not as the legend, not as the ghost, but as the brother who had once lifted her over creek water. Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, but she did not cry out. She knew better than to break the moment. He met her eyes briefly, just long enough to steady her, then turned his attention back to the town. The rifle moved with him, slow and precise. It was not a threat so much as a boundary drawn in air. He spoke without raising his voice, and yet it carried. Years of quiet had taught him how to let words travel. He told them to step away from the gallows. Told them no one would hang that morning. There was no flourish in it, no demand for applause. Just certainty. The gang laughed at first, sharp and nervous. Their leader stepped forward, hands spread in mock welcome, shouting about ghosts and fairy tales. He asked the town if they really planned to listen to a dead man. The rifle shifted. A shot cracked the air, not toward flesh, but wood. A beam at the edge of the gallows splintered, the rope jerking loose and falling slack. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, rolling back heavier than thunder. Silence followed, thick and absolute. No one laughed again. The gunman did not reload. He did not hurry. He simply adjusted his stance, climbing a step higher on the rise, gaining elevation. Distance had always been his ally. From here, the town was laid open, every street, every alley, every roofline visible. The rifle was no longer aimed at a single man, but at the lie holding them all hostage. He began to speak names. Not just names, but places. Dates. Crimes buried under dust and fear. A robbery outside Dry Fork. A murder blamed on a drifter who never made it out of the county. A girl paid off and sent away. With each word, a different outlaw stiffened, eyes darting, breath shortening. One reached for his gun and froze when the rifle's shadow crossed his chest. One by one, they set their weapons down. Hands went up. Voices cracked. Confessions spilled not because they were forced, but because the weight of being seen was finally too much to carry. The town listened, stunned, as truth walked free for the first time in months. The gunman told him he had followed the gang from territory to territory, watching, waiting, learning their habits. He had learned patience in exile, learned that judgment delivered from a distance lasted longer than rage unleashed up close. The rifle had taught him that. It had taught him restraint. He did not look at Eleanor when he said it was his fault, that his name had cast a shadow long enough for men like these to hide inside it. He said he had not returned for revenge. Revenge burned fast and left nothing standing. He had come back for balance, to make sure the debt he owed the world was paid by the right hands. The sheriff trembled where he stood, sweat darkening his collar. He saw his chance slipping away and panicked. In one desperate motion, the gang leader lunged, dragging the sheriff in front of him, a knife pressed tight against his throat. The crowd screamed. Eleanor stepped forward instinctively. The gunman did not move. His voice dropped, calm and lethal. He told the leader to let go. Told him this would end badly if he did not. The leader laughed, wild and shrill, backing toward the jailhouse wall, shouting that the rifle couldn't choose between two men at once. The gunman adjusted his grip, eyes narrowing, measuring wind and distance in consequence. The square held its breath, knowing the next moment would decide everything. The sun climbed higher until it stood almost directly above Red Willow, bleaching the color from the street and pressing the heat down onto shoulders and consciences alike. Noon had a way of stripping things bare. Shadows shrank. Lies grew uncomfortable. The crowd gathered in the square did not move, did not breathe easily. Every face was turned toward the rise beyond town, where the gunman remained, distant and immovable, a fixed point against the glare. He had not stepped closer. He did not need to. From where he stood, pistols were useless things, short-sighted, desperate. Distance belonged to him. Distance and time and the quiet certainty that came from choosing one moment over all others. The gang leader's arm trembled where it locked around the sheriff's throat. Sweat ran down both their faces, one from fear of consequence, the other from fear of truth. The knife's edge glinted in the sunlight, sharp and thin, a last argument from a man who had never learned another language. The gunman studied the scene through narrowed eyes. He saw the rise and fall of the leader's chest. He saw the angle of the blade, the way the sheriff's pulse fluttered against it. He felt the wind brush his cheek, light and steady from the west. He had learned long ago to listen to such things. The world always spoke before a shot. Most men were too loud to hear it. He did not shout. He did not count. He let the silence stretch until it hit. The gang leader barked something obscene, tightening his grip, daring the rifle to decide. The sheriff whimpered then, a small, broken sound that carried across the square and lodged itself in every listening ear. Eleanor stood rigid beneath the gallows, her heart hammering, her eyes fixed not on the knife but on her brother's face. She knew that look. It was the same one he wore as a boy when the world narrowed to a single necessary choice. The rifle came up smoothly, the movement economical, almost gentle. The stock settled into his shoulder as if it had always been waiting there. His breathing slowed. The front sight found its place, not on the knife, not on the sheriff, but on the small, precise space where control lived and ended. The shot broke the air cleanly. It was not loud in the way people expected. It did not roar or rage. It cracked once, sharp and final, and then the world caught up to it. The knife flew free, spinning uselessly before clattering to the dirt. The gang leader staggered back, a sudden vacancy where certainty had been, his legs giving way beneath him. He collapsed without drama, without spectacle, his power undone by a single truth delivered from afar. No one cheered. No one screamed. The sound faded into the canyon walls and did not return. The sheriff dropped to his knees, gasping, hands clawing at his throat as if to reassure himself he was still alive. Eyes turned toward him then, not with relief, but with accusation. The gunman's voice followed, calm and unyielding, listing names, payments, deals struck in back rooms and dark alleys. There was no place left to hide. The sheriff bowed his head, exposed at last by the same fear he had fed. Eleanor was unshackled where she stood. The iron fell away from her wrists, heavy and useless, hitting the dirt with a sound that echoed louder than chains ever should. She stepped down from the gallows slowly, feeling the ground beneath her feet as if for the first time. People made space for her without being asked. Some looked ashamed. Some looked grateful. All of them watched. The gunman finally lowered the rifle. He descended the rise at an unhurried pace, crossing the invisible line into town that he had held so carefully. People parted for him as if the air itself moved aside. He did not look left or right. His attention was fixed on one person only. When he reached Eleanor, they stood facing one another in the middle of the square, the gallows behind them, the town around them, the past heavy between them. Up close, the years showed more clearly. Lines carved deep by sun and consequence. Hands marked by work and recoil. He searched her face, as if counting breaths, as if reassuring himself that this part of the story was real. She touched his sleeve. Just once. Enough. There were no apologies spoken. No grand forgiveness offered. They understood each other too well for that. He had made choices. She had borne their weight. What passed between them was quieter and stronger than absolution. It was recognition. It was acceptance. It was love stripped of illusion. He told her to live. Told her the land was still hers. Told her the truth had been louder than the rope in the end. She told him he had always been more than the story said. That he still was. When someone called out, trying to thank him, trying to name him a hero, he raised a hand and shook his head. He did not belong to titles anymore. He slung the rifle across his back, wrapped it carefully, and turned away before gratitude could grow into legend. The sheriff was led off, small and diminished, by men who had found their courage too late, but not entirely. The remaining gang members were disarmed, bound, their confessions hanging heavier than any chain. Red Willow stood exposed beneath the sun, forced to see itself clearly for the first time in a long while. At the edge of town, the gunman paused. He did not look back. The horse waited patiently, ears flicking, ready for the road. He mounted with the ease of long habit and rode out toward the open land, where the canyons widened and the wind carried no names. By evening, he was already a rumor again. People would tell the story wrong. They would add fire where there had been restraint, cruelty where there had been precision. They would argue about whether he had truly returned or whether fear had conjured him from dust and memory. The details would blur. The truth would thin. But one thing would remain, carried quietly across the plains by those who had been there to see it. He was never a ghost. He was a man who came back only once, when justice had no other voice, and then disappeared into the same vast frontier that had tried, and failed, to bury him.